My name is Deanna Williams, and I am the Director for Diversity Student Programs. I would like to welcome everyone to our 2019 MLK Lecture. Every year around this time, students, faculty, and staff come together to honor and reflect on the legacy of Reverend Dr. King. At this very moment, I stand in front of you today as a staff member of the Emporia State community. But most importantly, I stand before you today as a Black woman. I get the pleasure of planning the MLK events on our campus, but I also get the pleasure of eating and being served at any restaurant I want without having to sit in a four-colored only section. I get the pleasure to go vote without being asked to guess how many pennies are in a jar. And lastly, I get the pleasure of saying that I am a graduate of a school that once denied Blacks an opportunity to attend. I recognize that although these are great advances, we are still affected by voter suppression, white supremacy, and patriarchy, and many more. Dr. King and many others spearheaded conversations around freedom, justice, and equality. And now today, as students, as faculty, as staff, as educators, we must do the same. So to those of you who are here today, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, I truly thank you for showing up today. And I hope that you are ready and willing to learn from our awesome speaker today. Dr. King quotes, "To the end, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." So I encourage you all to not be silent and to stand up and always do what is right. Now I will introduce Taylor Lee, who is the president of Black Student Union.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I don't like microphones. I set this one up today, and I don't like speaking in it. My name is Taylor Lee. I am the Black Student Union president. I was asked to come up here and speak about what Martin Luther King is to me. And when I was asked that, the first thing that came to mind was Martin Luther King's persistence. Now, growing up, we heard about Martin Luther King all the time, but it wasn't until I really got older and started dealing with obstacles in life that I really had a respect for him, I would say. To see and acknowledge how he kept going when things were in his way, people were in his way, and all he wanted was peace and unity, something so small but so big that people did not want to acknowledge. And so that's what he means to me. I think that's amazing, especially growing up and right now just in life and seeing and being an adult and seeing things through a different lens and perspective on how things actually are in this world, but being able to come out of my shell and speak up and really address situations the way he would have. Well, I hope he would have done it, because sometimes even when I want to say things the wrong way or probably use my fists a little bit more, but I know I can't because that's not what I'm about. I'm about unity and I'm about peace, and that's what I want to stand on, and that's what he stood on. So thank you.
Now we will have marketing major Gary Woods come up.
Good evening. I'm here to give a biography about our speaker today. Dr. Michael F. Jones II, Ph.D., a native of Ferguson, Missouri, who is responsible for the student engagement efforts at Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Jones is also the adjunct instructor at Missouri Baptist in the Department of Higher Education Administration. Dr. Jones is a proud graduate at St. Louis University, earning bachelor's and degrees of African American Studies, Sociology, and Theological Studies. And again in 2016 with a PhD in Higher Education Administration. As an undergraduate, Dr. Jones was very active on campus. He is a current member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. He was also involved in the basketball team and was also started a grassroots male retention program at Southern Illinois University in Edwards. Dr. Jones spent 3 years in Edwardsville, working in minority retention prior to relocating in Jackson, Missouri, where he pursued a master's degree in biblical studies from Reformed Theological Seminary, while also working adjunct professor at Missouri College. Dr. Jones' research interests include the exploration and the intersection of historical faith and spiritual traditions among African American college students. Jones views his professional role as an opportunity to engage and ignite vitality among our next generation. And now I present to you Dr. Michael F. Jones.
Good evening. Come on, y'all, talk back to me now. Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, it's good to be here. Get situated a little bit. I'm excited to be here tonight. I had some corky punch. Is that how you say it? It's pretty good. It's pretty good. I don't know what's in it. Is it? It's a secret. Okay. I'm gonna leave it at that. Well, first off, when Deanna sent me the message via social media, inquiring about this event, I thought to myself, clearly she must have me mistaken for another Mike Jones, because this is indeed a pleasure to be here, right, and to be able to come on this stage and talk about a man who is very near and dear to me. So Deanna, if you had somebody else in mind, I'm here now, and y'all stuck with me, all right? And special thanks to the diversity and inclusion team for considering me to be a part of this event. Was what already seems like to be an amazing week of events dedicated to the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Can you join me in giving a round of applause to everyone who has put in time and effort into this project, and you should consider yourselves lucky, I would say. Not many universities recognize the life and legacy of Dr. King for a full week. All right, you usually get a couple hours on Dr. King Day, but rarely do you get a full week that focuses on Dr. King. So whoever was involved with that, I'm sure it took a lot of time and energy, but in finances and resources, but I'm glad you did it. All right. And I'm excited to really, again, dive into, like I said, the life and legacy of a man who I've admired for a long time, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I place special emphasis on that Reverend piece, most specifically because when you explore the dynamics of Dr. King, when you get into the pomp and circumstances of who he was as a man, the Reverend part oftentimes get left out, right? And I would argue that if you're really gonna dive into who Dr. King was as a man, as a father, as a political figure, or as a community member, you can't separate him from his experiences from the African American church. And so oftentimes when we do that, I think it's very, very important that we include that piece of his experience. And so Dr. Martin Luther King Day, when it comes around, this is what typically happens, right? You wake up in the morning, you kind of check your social media timeline, and then you see all the pictures of Dr. King. You're like, oh, it is Dr. King Day, right? Right? And then you go to Google, and then you Google favorite MLK quote, just like that. You just go to Google and say favorite MLK quote, and you find that quote, and you find a picture of Dr. King, and then you post it on your social media, show everybody that you woke, and then you just move on with your day, right? Did that offend anybody? No, that's good, because if it offended you, you the one I'm talking about, right? So, but that's oftentimes how we view our figures, the people who are important, who've really made impact on society, and it's not all our fault, right? We're inundated with all of this data and all of this information on a daily basis, and so it's really hard to take time and reflect on the life and legacy of who those people were and what they contributed to society. So anyway, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So just before his death, while ministering in a church in Chicago, Illinois, King uttered these words. But before I was a civil rights leader, I was a preacher of the gospel. This was my first calling, and it still remains my greatest commitment. You know, actually, all that I do for civil rights, I do because I consider it a part of my ministry. I have no other ambitions in life but to achieve excellence in the Christian ministry. I don't plan on running for any political office. I don't plan on doing anything but remaining a preacher. And what I'm doing in this struggle, along with many others, grows out of my feeling that the preacher must be concerned about the whole man. Right? And my point in this is that when you consider Martin, he's a preacher among preachers, if you will. He's a product of the black church experience. And I argue that unless you have some sort of knowledge about the black church experience, you will not be able to fully comprehend nor appreciate the man, the myth, the legend, also known as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And then furthermore, what I hope to argue, sandwiched between Martin's foundational experience of the black church, is his quest for making meaning and purpose for himself throughout his educational pursuits, right? I can't leave that out. I'm a trained student affairs professional, so that's what we look at, right? We look at your experiences as students outside the classroom. And so because I have this weird, well, I don't know how to even put it in words. That's what I like doing. I like to see how students form, right? I like to see you when you come in as freshmen and what you look like when you leave as seniors, right? Makes me poke my chest out a little bit more, right? And I'm sure faculty and staff in the building can relate, right? So we're going to explore King from those two perspectives. We're going to look at him from the black church experience, and secondly, from his educational pursuits. So the question for tonight that arises for us is, while we're looking at the lived experiences of King, how does one really reconcile the big questions of life that Sharon Parks labels a shipwreck period? This is the time and experience in life when life challenges start to hit and they mount up against you, and you reach this, what is called a fork in the road. Am I going to fight, or am I going to fly away? These are all the experiences that offer a deeper meaning for us to challenge and push further. And the result that happens when we hit that fork in the road is that wisdom is acquired, resilience and grit is an outcome, but before you get to the other side of the fork in the road, there's a process involved, and that's our formation. So my hope tonight is to shed a little light on King's process towards establishing meaning and purpose for his life that was cut short on August 4th, 1968. But I'm gonna let you know up front, it ain't all pretty. It's not all pretty, but it's authentic. And ultimately, if we're gonna live up to the dreams and ideals that Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. preached, we need people who are not afraid to be authentic. Are y'all with me? Come on now, y'all with me? So let's dive on in. So if you've never, by show of hands, who's been in a black church before? Okay, so a lot of y'all. So in the black church, you have this thing called call and response, right? So it's this tradition that was formed during the time of slavery, when slaves would communicate to one another about different escape routes, right? Or they would communicate to each other about what's called hush harbors. These are when slaves would steal away in the middle of the night, and they would go have secret spiritual experiences with each other. Right, and so it oftentimes would start with a leader that would recite something, and then the slaves would respond. Right, and this tradition that's carried on throughout the black church experience, as well as you'll see it in traditions like Black Greek life, right, with calls and response, and as well as within the civil rights movement, how they would take songs and spirituals and turn them into freedom songs, right? So this call and response piece. Let me just test the room, see if y'all know one. God is good, and all the time. Right. Whether you believe it or not, that's one of the examples of it. So we gonna go to black church right now. Y'all ready? Ready. Come on now. If black church call and respond, y'all ready? Yeah. All right. Good morning, saints. Good morning. Yes. These are your church announcements on this lovely Sunday morning, June 7th, 1935, at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, located at 450 Suite Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia, where our pastor is none other than the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. Please govern yourselves accordingly. Saints, the building fund is still in need of donations. We are looking to burn our mortgage 18 months ahead of schedule. Let the church say amen. Amen. Oh, y'all catching on good. Pastor Mlk King Sr. is also requesting that the parishioners make a donation to those in need, as we continue to provide food, clothing, a daycare center for those among us who can't do for themselves. We are also asking that those among us who are able, please join us on Wednesday night as Pastor King Sr. will be speaking on behalf of the local chapter of the NAACP to discuss the challenges of racial segregation for Negroes in the Deep South. But last, but certainly not least, our children's choir, under the direction of First Lady Alberta King, that's Martin's mother, will be rendering musical selections at the local soup kitchen immediately following morning worship. Please govern yourselves accordingly. You see, these are the type of experiences that young Martin would have been exposed to from a very young age. His father, Daddy King, as he was called, was known throughout the community, and before moving up from rural Georgia with nothing but bad memories of sharecropping. It was in Atlanta that he met Alberta Williams, the daughter of Reverend A.D. Williams, who was the former pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church. But prior to marrying Alberta, Daddy King was encouraged to first finish school. You see, education was held in high regard in the King's family. It was viewed as the great equalizer. So ML Jr., as he was called, was a chip off the old block. He was so smart that he skipped his freshman year of high school and was accepted as an early enrollee at Morehouse College at the age of 15. Through a program that accepted gifted young men, primarily due to low enrollment due to the war efforts. But as an undergrad, King was a subpar student, more concerned with chasing women than his studies. He graduated from Morehouse in 1948 with a mere C average GPA. In the same year, Emil gave his first trial sermon at Ebenezer before traveling up north to attend Crozier Theological Seminary near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so keep in mind what our 2 points are. We're here to talk about the black church experience, but as well as Emil's formation, right? So within 1948, we're talking about this time, he had a C average, right? He was a subpar student, and you can see ML walked around. He had this group of friends, and if you read some excerpts from his biography, but he had this group of friends, and they called themselves in some cases the Thrashers. Right? They would walk around dressed really nice and just talking to women the entire time. That was his concern in school. But then somehow, between those short years of undergrad and graduation, he had kind of figured things out, right? He kind of figured things out and then gave in to his call, if you will, and gave his first sermon at his father's church before going up to seminary. So if you can imagine for a second what life for young Martin may have been like growing up in Atlanta, right? The son of an upper class, middle class, if you will, black family with a pastor who everyone in your community knows about. Well, I can relate to King a little bit, because I too am a third-generation Black Baptist minister who grew up in the trenches of Black church culture and its unwritten demands and social expectations that are placed on those in leadership that inadvertently trickles down to their family. So common outcomes among children whose parents are clergy include high levels of stress due to pressure and unrealistic expectations. You go through identity dilemmas, rebellion, sexual promiscuity, and what is considered the worst of all outcomes, a complete separation from the faith experience itself. So my argument is that if you examine the life and lived experiences of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you will see aspects of all the above-mentioned pieces that contributed to his formation towards meaning-making and ultimately understanding his life purpose. So early in his formation process, Martin had about 3 experiences that really shaped his understanding about race and religion. The first experience came as a young kid when he had a young white friend that he would oftentimes play baseball with, and then as Martin was growing up, they lived on Auburn Avenue. It was during the times when whites were starting to move out, and so when they first moved over there, it wasn't uncommon for him to have a white neighbor. And so his first encounter with race came when he would play ball with his friend who was white, and then one day his friend came to him and said, "I can't play with you anymore because you're a Negro." So Martin had that conversation that many of us have often had with our parents, with that first encounter with race. And his parents had to sit him down and explain to him, "Martin, these are the way things are in Jim Crow South," right? And so that experience stuck with him. And then the second experience that he recalls is when he was in the shoe store. He was walking in a shoe store with his father, and his father was a very stern man, And he remembers going into the shoe store with his dad, and his dad goes into the shoe store, and they sit down, and the clerk comes up to him and says, "Well, if you want to be served, you have to go around back, and we will serve you." And Daddy King said so eloquently, "Well, if you won't serve me here, I won't buy your shoes." And so Martin remembers that experience walking away with his dad, and his dad looking at him in the eye and said, "You're a man, you're a man, you're a man." He doesn't remember the little things that his dad says, but he remembers that his dad calling him and saying, "You're a man, your money is good, just as good as anybody else's money." And then the third experience that Martin recalls that really shaped his experience about race was when he was a young boy, right before he was going off to Morehouse. He went down to Dublin, Georgia, for a speech competition. And if you go into the archives and look up Martin, he was a very competitive man. Right? If you talk to his friends, you talk to Ralph Abernathy, they will tell you about how competitive Martin Luther King Jr. was. And so he went down to this speech competition where he got second place. And so they went all the way down to Dublin, Georgia, and they took the bus down there. And then he remembers coming back on the bus, and they made their way up to Macon, Georgia, which is about 90 miles south of Atlanta, and all of these white passengers got on the bus, and then Martin remembers the bus driver yelling back at him and his friends while he was still soaking in the fact that he had that second place speech trophy in his hand. The bus driver looks in the back and says, "Hey, you Negro son of a bitches, take your ass back to the back of the bus." Right? So Martin remembers that, and he sees this sea of white people that comes on the bus, and there's no seats left. So he's forced for 90 miles to stand up on the back of the bus while still dealing with the experiences of just having lost the speech competition. So this was Martin's, this was his formation of race. Martin openly admitting to hating white people. Right? As a young man, he admits to hating white people. Michael Eric Dyson, who's considered a Martin scholar, he says when he talks about Martin Luther King, he says he raises the question: is it possible to love somebody so much and not trust them at all? And so he does that, and he does that in terms of how he related Martin Luther King's experiences to the dominant race. He says he taking Martin's love ethic but not trusting them, and Michael Eric Dyson kind of raises that question about that. So those are Martin's experiences with race early on, and I think that's important because if on Martin Luther King Day we don't talk about that. Right? We talk about how much he loved. We talked about turn the other cheek. We talk about his principles of nonviolence, but we don't talk about his formation process for getting there, right? And I think that's important to discuss. Also, his formation process with his religious experience. Martin was embarrassed by the black church. He was embarrassed by the black church as a young man. And he would often talk about the black church in the context of the emotionalism that was attached to it. He in more words or less, he said it doesn't take all that, right? And so in his opinion, he would never go into what would be the family business, right? Being the third generation minister, he wanted to go as far away from ministry as he possibly could. So that's why he went to Morehouse. First, he started off in medicine. Then he went into law because he wanted to be a lawyer to fight civil rights cases, but he had no intention on becoming a minister. But somehow in those 3 years, he gave in to his calling, and before going off to seminary, he gave his first trial sermon. So again, excuse me. So we talked about Martin's undergrad experience with his coming from the black social elite class, and how important it was to pursue education with his C average GPA, right? And I look at this in terms of as a student affairs professional, how we view students who come into the university, right? Some who are undecided, it's kind of like this untapped potential. And that's the way I kind of view Martin's experience as an undergrad. It was an untapped potential, or underdeveloped potential, if you would, because he had a lot of mentees and mentors around him, but he wasn't quite there yet. He wasn't quite formed, right? How many undecided majors we have in here? Oh, everybody. So yeah, everybody decided? That's awesome. That's a first, right? You came in knowing what you want to do, or it was a process? It was a process, right? And that's what Martin was. It was a process. But then when he went off to seminary, this is this identity piece that I was talking about earlier. So Martin goes off to seminary, and he's well aware of the negative stereotypes that are associated with African Americans. So he goes up to the north, and he did everything in his power to prove that he was different. He was different, right? He even talks about not even eating fried chicken or watermelon around his classmates because he knew about the negative stereotypes that people thought about African Americans at the time. And he never left his dormitory without pressing his clothes to a T. Right? He never went to class late. He dedicated himself for the first time to his studies because his goal was to prove people wrong. And so that's an identity question. That's an identity question. And so the identity question that for Martin formed into something bigger, and it was a part of his process. So, and some of us know what it's like to have to function as a minority within a dominant culture space. Right? But Martin viewed this opportunity as a training ground because he knew that while he was a black Baptist minister, he knew that his calling was to the world, and that this seminary experience was going to give him the opportunity to connect with people worldwide, right? So he viewed that seminary experience as that. But he never lost touch for his foundation. Like W.E. Du Bois calls this double consciousness, right? Having to function in two different worlds and know two different dialects. Anybody can relate to that a little bit? And that's the way Martin functioned during his seminary experience. And then we talked a little bit also before about rebellion. Martin Martin also entertained the possibility while he was up at seminary of dating a white woman. He fell in love with a woman named Betty, whose relationship started to grow. But then when after about 6 months or so, when he felt himself falling in what he would call too deep, he called things off because he was afraid to call home and tell his mom that he was dating a white woman, which would have been a rebellion of his southern roots, right? It would have been something that his family would have been against. So he called things off with his friend Betty. And then thirdly, his PhD pursuits. Martin went straight into a PhD program at Boston University after he completed seminary. And it's been confirmed that King's dissertation work was not his own, meaning he plagiarized a great portion of his dissertation work. And then a couple of theories exist as to why King fell short in this process, and I think those are worth exploring because they're very real possibilities. As I told you before, King was very competitive. Right, and it was important. It may have been important to him to pursue these things because when you're talking about the black church context, when anyone in leadership, whether you doctorate degree or not, if you can talk well and sing well, they call you doctor. Right, it's just a cultural thing, and so to be called doctor and having earned that degree may have been something that MLK had in mind. Even though he had no interest in pursuing the academy, he just wanted to possibly prove that he could do it. And then secondly, another theory that goes against why MLK may have plagiarized his dissertation is because he may have intentionally chosen a subject that was unrelated to the black experience. Right, and this is a very real thing even to this day. For those of you who have aspirations to go on and pursue doctoral work, for many minorities, I would say, many minorities do their dissertation or research on the communities from which they come. And the fear is that if you pursue your dissertation in the field or experiences that are your lived experiences, that you get pigeonholed, right? You get pigeonholed to the black scholar, or you get pigeonholed to the Latinx scholar, because that's oftentimes the field that you choose to do your research in. And this may have been one of the things that Martin feared as to why he would not pursue an experience related to the black experience. And then thirdly, and this is a point that most of the critics of Dr. King use to blame him for his moral failures is his relentless and repetitive adultery habit, right? And that's also proven that as someone who spent most of his adult life on the road. Dr. King spent maybe a weekend or so out of each month at home with his family. And some of King's closest friends confirm that he had a struggle with fidelity and staying faithful to his family and to his wife. But in addition to those things that negatively contributed to Dr. King's experience, I think it's also important to note as a part of his formation, his noteworthy experiences as well, right? In 1955, he led the Montgomery Boyce boycott. Right, in 1963, he co-led the March on Washington, where he gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. In 1965, the March in Selma. 1964, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Not to mention that his influence and leadership is second to none. And mind you, he died at 39 years old. Right? So to be able to accomplish all those things in a young life is very noble within itself. So and to kind of retract back to Park's theory of shipwreck, right? I believe that King's fork in the road experience. Y'all remember the fork in the road experience where you hit the fork in the road and you're either gonna fight or you're gonna fight, right? So I believe that King hit his fork in the road experience in Montgomery, Alabama, right? King had just finished his PhD and he had moved back south to take on his first pastorate at a church in Montgomery, Alabama. And that's when he accepted his role into the movement. I believe that if you talk to King prior to the meeting where he accepted his first role in the movement, he had no intention on getting into the civil rights movement. His goal was to come down, take his first pastorate, grow the church, and then move back to Atlanta and become the president of Morehouse College after Benjamin Mays retired. That was King's plan for his life. Right? But then when he hit that fork in the road, when most of the older pastors within the Birmingham community, they reached out to King and said, we're going to have this meeting at your church, right? They took because he was the freshman, he was a young guy in the city, so they kind of forced him into that place and said, hey, you're going to lead this movement, and that's what he did. And so that was his fork in the road. King could have said, you know what, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I'm here to do my job, and I'm going to do my job. I don't want any trouble. But he didn't. He accepted his role within the movement. And I think that ultimately culminated in the events that would lead up to his last speech on Wednesday, April 3rd, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. So if we can fast forward to April 3rd, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, just a week earlier, King had led a march that had erupted in violence. And against the advice of his SCLC leaders, King returned to Memphis, Tennessee on April 3rd, determined to finish the rally in the march in nonviolence. It was a stormy evening, right? The weather advisors were suggesting that people stay home. On top of that, King had fallen ill with a sore throat and a fever. So he decided to send along his best friend, Ralph Abernathy, to speak in his place. Once Abernathy stepped onto the podium to speak, he could see and feel the disappointment in the people's eyes. Then he immediately phoned over to the Lorraine Motel, requesting that Martin come right away to say a few words to the people. I would argue that it was sometime between that call from Ralph Abernathy and the ride over to the Mason Temple that Martin experienced the divine. Right? It's that time where he had that encounter with the divine, where the divine came down and ultimately told Martin what his true purpose was in life. Right? What his true purpose was in the movement. And if I can invoke my spiritual imagination for a second, it was similar to the story in the biblical narrative where God calls Moses up to the mountain and shows him the promised land, but also tells him that you're not going to be a part of it. Right? So I believe Martin had that similar experience sometime between that call from Ralph Abernathy and the time he made his way over to the Mason Temple. But I also believe that call and that experience with the divine ultimately gave Martin that peace and courage to deliver what will become his final speech. And I just want to read an excerpt from that speech. And if you get a chance, if you haven't seen that speech, if you get a chance, YouTube it. It's very moving when you see like his literal body and what it's doing throughout the speech. But I just want to give a little excerpt with what I just said in mind. So Martin had just got off. He's given the speech and he's talking about having gotten on the plane to go to Memphis, and it was delayed because they had to check the bags because he was on the plane. And the pilot made the announcement. He said, Martin Luther King is on the plane, so we wanted to check the bags, make sure there were no threats on the plane, and we wanted to make sure everything was safe. They had the plane watched all night, and they wanted to just make sure everything was safe. And then I pick up here. And then I got into Memphis, and some began to talk about the threats that were out there, or that what will happen from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. I'm so happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the coming of the glory of the Lord. And as he finished that speech, he literally fell back. His friends had to physically grab him and place him into his seat, right? And then they said when he sat down, he wept like a little baby, right? And later that night, early in that morning, he was assassinated. Right? And so what do we take from this? And mind you, too, 4 days later after he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, I told you he was competitive, right? So only in true spirit, Coretta Scott King, along with her 3 kids, brought him up to Memphis, Tennessee, and finished that march, right? With nonviolence, rather. 4 days after. Can you imagine? Like your spouse being killed in another city, and then not just you coming, but you bring in your legacy with you, and that's exactly what she did. So, what can we learn from the formation experience of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? First, I would argue that we ought to challenge ourselves to apply a more critical lens to the people that we honor. We got to do that, y'all. Not as a means to expose them, but as a means for personal reflection and growth. King's formation could inspire all of us to make all of us better. And then secondly, in terms of meaning making, understand that meaning making is a process that's not always pretty, but eventually it will bear positive fruit, right? This event tonight is a result of King's meaning making, right? It's a result of his process. This is a fruit of King's process. So with that being said, in the tradition of the black church, I need y'all to do me one thing as I close. Do me one favor as I close. Y'all ready? Y'all. So I need you to turn to your neighbor. Turn to your neighbor. Say, neighbor. Come on now. Turn to your neighbor. Say, neighbor. Oh, neighbor. All right, we're going to get this together. Come on, let's start over. Turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor. Oh, neighbor. Go forth and bear fruit. Thank y'all. Yeah.
Let's give a round of applause for Dr. Michael Jones. I say the scholar, as he educated us tonight. Now we will take some questions, whether it's questions on how do we move forward as a community, any reflection on Dr. King. We can hear from the students as well about some of the experience that they faced and make this a very civilized dialogue as well. So if you have any questions, please just raise your hand. I don't want to run around with the mic, but if you can speak up, that'll be great. But if you can't hear us, we can use the mic for sure, okay? You all don't go at once. Yes?
Yeah, so you talked about this pressure when you're writing a dissertation to write about something that's connected to the community you came from. What did he write on? What was the dissertation about?
So he ended up writing about Paul Tillich, who's a theologian, and Paul Tillich's philosophical. You caught me on this. So Paul Tillich had this theory. So it's basically this theory of good and evil. And so King concentrated on Paul Tillich's theory of good and evil. It had something to do with what he was eventually looking into in the movement. Because King, what he would do is, and I argue that it's a part of his process of proving people wrong. Like, don't you know, oftentimes when the faculty offer those popular classes based off what's going on in the movement, King was the kid who who would not go to those popular classes. So like right now, if it's a popular class on Black Lives Matter, King was like, no, I'm gonna take Aristotle, right? And so like he would intentionally go against the grain in many ways and many experiences, and which I think ultimately led him to being like the movement for all, so he can relate to all. He can talk to grandmothers and babies, right? And I think part of that process was like the challenges that he faced in his dissertation.
Okay, so appreciate your remarks tonight, and particularly the effort you made at showing the human side of government. And I think sometimes when people hear speeches like this, they're a little bit disillusioned because we take these kinds of people and we put them on a pedestal and we maybe impose something, some sense of goodness, I guess, that no human could live up to. And I just wondered if you could talk about that just a little bit. How do we balance great respect for a person while at the same time realizing that, like the rest of us, they're very flawed? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. And I would just highlight again my last point. We got to be critical. We got to be critical. We got to approach leadership. We got to approach the people that we place in leadership with a critical lens. And I think the more we're able to apply a critical lens, the better off we'll be. And when you should apply a critical lens to everything you're doing especially within your academic experience, right? Always thinking critical about it. I think that's step one, right? And then once you get the outcomes of critical analysis, it's going to lead you somewhere. Thank you.
Yes. So personally in your life, kind of asking for a reflection how Martin Luther King kind of changed the way you think.
Oh man. So that's a great question. Like I didn't talk about that. Like so I grew up in a house where Martin Luther King's picture is like on my parents' walls, right? You would have thought he was my uncle or something, right? And that's just the way it was. I grew up with seeing Martin's picture with Grandma's picture, I grew up hearing his speeches. In terms of preaching style, that's the way my grandfather preached. He preached like Dr. King. That's the way my father preached, right, like Dr. King. So it wasn't until I got to undergrad, and I remember, I'll never forget it. Like it was like freshman or sophomore year, and I came into college majoring in physical therapy, right? Until I got into that first biology class and changed real quick. But I'll never forget, we're walking like how at the beginning of the school year and they having the majors, they're all out say, hey, come and join this major. So I see African American studies, and the lady stops me. She's like, hey, you should take a class in AFAM studies. I was like, what you gonna tell me about being black? Like Martin Luther King is on my wall. I know black studies, right? And then she was like, just take a class. So I took a class, and and I started to dive deep into who Martin was. And I remember going through this process where like I was ashamed, right? I was ashamed of the things that he did. Like you would read stuff, and if you can look into some of that stuff with the FBI tapes. You see a side of Martin that's not picturesque, right? And so I would start to see that, but then it eventually led me to really appreciating the man who he was, right? They said when Martin died, his heart was equal to like being a 90-year-old man, right? Like the condition of his heart. And so when you hear Martin talk about, like, anytime he's given a award, he's extremely humble. Extremely humble. He doesn't listen to his drum major instinct sermon, where they actually played at his funeral, and he talks about what he wants to be remembered by. But I think that's coupled with like how he was living his life in this balance of trying to do good, but yet evil is always there, right? And so that really, when I was able to look at Martin from that lens, I was able to take more from him as a man and ultimately appreciate him for who he was and what he contributed to the world. No comments? What, like, thoughts? What's up? Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna try my best to try to simplify this. So
She said she was going to get me with questions too, so I'm a little.
I'm trying to simplify. So I think what struck me from what you said was that like students of color, when they get into higher education, they do try to pursue like studies related to the population they come from, and I can relate to that.
You
And
can?
I can.
Okay.
And so I guess my question is twofold, which is, you know, have you experienced that kind of experience, that thing of being pigeonholed into that area? And if so, like, what are your thoughts related to maybe you or anyone that might have?
Yeah, good question. Did y'all hear it? So she basically Kim, did I get it right?
Yeah.
Kim, what's your role again?
I'm the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee Chair. I'm nervous right now. And the Associate Student Government.
All right, so Kim has a very important role here at the university, right? But her question was in terms of being pigeonholed to study something from the community from whence you came, right? And did I feel that pressure? I did, but I also went and studied the community from whence I came, because that's why I felt what my role is. That's why I ultimately moved back to St. Louis and to Ferguson, because I wanted to contribute to the work that was going on. But I was that kid in class, I was like when you're the only minority in class and they talking about slavery or the black question and everybody's like. I was that kid who was gladly able to raise his hand and educate folks. But that's not everybody's space and place, right? And we need folks in both realms. Like, we need minorities in STEM, right? We need minorities in other areas, but it's about that formation piece, right? Like learning who you are, because the person I was as a freshman majoring in physical therapy was a completely different person I was when I left St. Louis University, right? But it's about experiencing different things, experiencing different people, and ultimately living to who your truth is. Yes.
At the very beginning of your speech, you mentioned that a number of people did was on Martin Luther King Day was that they would find their favorite quote and then they would post it.
You ain't do that, did you?
No.
Okay.
Out of curiosity though, what is your favorite quote, but like what's the context behind it? Like why is that your favorite quote, knowing Martin Luther King?
Right. I don't know if I have a favorite Martin Luther King quote. I really don't. Like I resonate more with his sermons. Like I'll listen to his sermons all day. But I don't necessarily have a favorite Martin Luther King quote. There's a bunch of good ones, but I don't have a favorite one personally. Sorry, I didn't answer that question better. Yes.
Okay, so earlier when you answered my question, you kind of said you became a little ashamed whenever you chose African American studies. And so going broader into our community, why do certain conversations have a stigma about it to kind of make us want to shy away from it rather than talking about it?
So did y'all hear that? As I'm thinking about it, can you kind of say that again, because I need to hear it again.
It was a little bit of handful, but mouthful. But earlier he was talking about how when he chose to become a major kind of in African American studies, he kind of had a little shame associated with it. And it's been a trend that I've noticed amongst kids of my generation of our color. We're kind of shy away from certain topics and certain conversations that deal with, the problems that our ancestors have dealt with. Mm-hmm. And so I'm asking you, do you have a theory of why that stigma has risen within our community?
Right. Do I have a theory? I don't know if I necessarily have a theory of why that stigma has arisen, but I think context is everything. So, like if you're a minority amongst non-minorities, I can see where that sense of embarrassment can come from, because the question always follows is like the black on black crime, but you never hear about white on white crime, which is higher. But you know, and so like you when you get in certain spaces where you have to, quote unquote, like I was saying, kind of defend. Like I can see why that's shying away. And then secondly, I think the sense of embarrassment comes from lack of knowledge, right? You'll be surprised, like how, like for example, when I was working at SIUE, like my art in my room was in my office was intentional, and then when kids would come in there, whether you black, white, orange, or purple, I'm quizzing you, right? And I have Jack Johnson or Malcolm X or the Little Rock Nine, right? Or just I would rotate Black history pictures on my wall, and our students in particular, they don't know their history, and it's not all their fault. It's not being taught in schools, right? And a lot of times it's not being taught in the house, and so that's why these kind of experiences are crucial. Taking courses in African American studies as well as other indigenous populations as well are crucial, because if the story is not told, it'll get lost, and so when the more you know, I think the less the less likely you are to feel embarrassed and feel empowered by your history. But it takes time.
I have a question.
Question.
As a Black male, because you've worked in higher education and currently work in higher education, how have you navigated higher education with your identity?
Yeah, good question. So like, again, I stress this formation piece because like when I got to college, like, cause I played ball in undergrad, right? And so when you go off to, when you go off to a school like St. Louis University, like that's a highly competitive Division I level like program. Your identity is that program, right? Your identity is sports, and I'm sure you can relate too as a football player, right? Like your identity is that, and then there's class, right? And so I found myself like wearing my identity with my athletics, right? I played ball my entire life, and I got to school. That's what I did. That's how I related to people. That's how I spoke to people. That's the way I dressed, and that was the dressing. Like always putting on my gears partially because I always used to get messed with by the public safety officers. So I would wear my gear to show I was a part of that community. But that's a whole nother story. But that identity, that's who I formed my identity with, and then. Like towards the end of my basketball wasn't as important anymore, and I wanted to do other things. I wanted to pledge a fraternity. I wanted to see what student government was about. So I stopped playing ball, and then I was forced to like have certain kind of conversations that didn't have anything to do with basketball for the first time. And so once that happened, it was like, you know, they don't want to talk about basketball. What am I going to do? But then it forces you into uncomfortable spaces, and so that identity formed from that. And then I got into higher ed because, like, I would see my African American teammates like using up 4 years of eligibility, but they're not graduating. Like, I got teammates who have billboards and commercials, and then the next year, like once they get hurt or something, they back at home, and I was like, something wrong with this. Right, and so that's how I got into higher ed. Like to your point, like that community piece, because I could relate to my student athlete teammates, right? But somebody had to go into the academy and research this stuff, and because oftentimes the research that is being done by the people, the research that has been done about the people aren't the people. Does that make sense? Right? So nobody can tell you about your community like you. Right, so you have to put in the work and tell your story. So that's what's ultimately kind of gives me the fire to wake up every morning and do this kind of work.
I'll ask. Oh, okay.
Yes. And I'm sorry, I forgot to ask, like, the people that ask, where y'all from? Like, where were you from? What's your name and where you from?
I'm Megan. I'm from Olathe.
Where is that at?
Oh, sorry, Olathe, Kansas.
Okay. And Oklahoma City. Where you from, Kim?
I'm from Oklahoma City too.
Hey, and what's your name and where you from?
My name is Leslie and I'm from Kansas City.
Okay.
I
I'm sorry about Sunday, by the way.
No, it's no I just had a question. Did you ever, like, through college or even now, did you experience anything like racial? Like, I've known many like universities and like people that like experience stuff like that. So I was just wondering.
Oh, you got enough time? Shoot. Yeah, I mean, like the part of the piece I was talking. Her question was, have you ever experienced any racism? Yeah, all the time, right? Like in college, in the college setting in particular? Yeah. Oh yeah, right? And I've experienced a lot of invert racism and like one example was like I was outside, my tire was flat, and the public safety, I'm staying on public safety. They come up to me and be like, let me see your ID. Just make sure I wasn't stealing my own car, right? And then he drove off and didn't help me with my tire, right? And the other like the subtle kind of racism that I would experience a lot is from faculty who, right? And I can tell like faculty member when they were nervous to be around me, and like so they'll do things like automatically go to sports, right? Like they'll go right to sports, or they'll use like slang, or they'll let me off the hook in a lot of ways, right? And ultimately what I would say is like, when I'm looking back on those experiences, it's like I would say their expectations of me weren't very high. And I felt it. I felt it in advising appointments, like, why don't you just take this class, right? And not so much challenging me in ways that I felt I could be challenged. And so those are the type of things that you really have to watch, I think, as a student, and you just constantly really evaluating what your worth is. So when you go into certain spaces, you got to know what you want, and I think people can fall in line after that. But yeah, those are some of the experiences that I had as an undergrad.
And I'll be the last one to pick you back up off of Leslie. What advice would you give some of our student leaders who are activists and who are like fighting for changes on campus, whether that's just equality or even African American courses and more people that look like them? How would you encourage them to keep, demanding what they need?
Yeah. Do we have African American courses here, by the way? Working on it? Okay, we're working on it. My advice to like even students in general is like to recognize the power that you have as students. Like if y'all want change, like y'all can make change, and you can make change that faculty and staff can't, right? Because you just have that kind of social capital to be able to make change if you can collectively come together and do those things. Like if you look at the history of any movement, you look at the dynamics of the civil rights movement wouldn't be what it was if it not for college student sit-ins, right? Because literally college students can just go shut down a restaurant, get put in a paddy wagon and go to jail. Then the next group of college students can go off because you may have a job, but you don't have to worry about a mortgage. Most of you don't have to worry about a mortgage. You don't have major bills. You don't have those things. So recognize your power as college students, and then in terms of that social capital piece, that's very, very important. And what I mean by social capital, you as college students, you should be establishing or looking to establish your social capital from day one, right? And that's your networks of people that are providing you with leadership opportunities. So when you leave here, you're not looking for ways to lead. You're already having those foundations as undergrads, right? And you get those by getting those experiences here, right? By becoming involved with student government, by being faculty assistants, right? And then understand lastly that change does not happen overnight, right? And that includes when you email your professor at 12 a.m. and you want that response by 1 a.m., right? Change don't happen overnight. It's a process. It's a formation, right? But when it happens, it will bear fruit, just like I said, right? So if you have struggles, stick with the process. Remember, change don't happen overnight. Establish your social capital, and then it will bear positive fruit. Cool. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. In conclusion, I would like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Tomorrow, we will conclude our MLK events with a lunch on us that will take place during the lunch hour in the Blue Key room, leadership room, which is down this hallway to my left. If you're interested in coming out, we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement and also discussing some of the other prominent leaders during the civil rights movement that were very close to Dr. King as well. So I hope that you all have enjoyed tonight. We still have some more snacks and some more Corky's Punch over here, so my students grab those. If you have any questions for me, myself, Taylor, or Dr. Jones, let us know. Have a good night.